The forest stretched endlessly before me, an ancient tapestry of towering trees and dense underbrush. Though I'd spent more than half my life patrolling these woods, this particular area felt different. It was known but rarely visited, a place that most rangers and hikers avoided. Legends whispered of strange occurrences and eerie happenings, but I'd never put much stock in them. Until now. I had been a forest ranger for 25 years, and I prided myself on knowing every inch of this land. The forest had been my sanctuary, a place of solace and tranquility. It was where I felt most at home, surrounded by nature's raw beauty and its untamed wildness. But as I ventured deeper into the heart of this rarely trodden path, a sense of unease began to creep over me. My name is Mark Reynolds, and I became a forest ranger right out of college. It was a career that called to me, offering a life away from the chaos of the city and a chance to be a steward of the natural world. Over the years, I'd seen my fair share of oddities. Strange animal behavior, unusual weather patterns, and the occasional lost hiker with a wild story to tell. But nothing had prepared me for what I was about to encounter. I was nearing the end of my career, with retirement only a few years away. My colleagues often joked that I was more a part of the forest than the trees themselves. I'd spent countless nights under the stars, guided by the rhythms of the wilderness. It was a life I loved and understood, or so I thought. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was crisp and cool, with a hint of impending winter. I had been following a deer trail when I stumbled upon something unexpected: an old, abandoned cabin, hidden away in a thicket of overgrown brush and ivy. The cabin looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Its wooden walls were weathered and gray, with moss creeping up the sides. The roof sagged in places, and the windows were dark and empty, like the eyes of a long-forgotten ghost. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached it, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed open the creaking door, and it swung inward with a groan of protest. Inside, the cabin was musty and dim, with the faint smell of decay hanging in the air. Dust motes danced in the shafts of dying sunlight that filtered through the gaps in the walls. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I stepped inside, my flashlight casting a narrow beam of light that cut through the gloom. The cabin was a single room, sparsely furnished. A rickety table stood in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs. An old cast iron stove sat in one corner, its surface rusted and cold. There were remnants of a life once lived here: a faded quilt draped over a broken bed frame, a stack of yellowed newspapers, and a collection of empty jars on a shelf. But it was the far wall that caught my attention. There, pinned to the wooden planks, were dozens of photographs. They were old and grainy, black and white images that seemed out of place in this forgotten cabin. As I moved closer, I felt a knot form in my stomach. The photographs were of people, men, women, and children, all with expressions of fear and despair etched on their faces. I decided to spend the night near the cabin, setting up my tent a safe distance away. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong with this place, but I needed to understand what I had found. As darkness fell, the forest around me seemed to come alive with strange sounds. The usual chorus of nocturnal creatures was absent, replaced by an unsettling silence. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My flashlight revealed nothing out of the ordinary, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Shadows danced at the edge of the light, and I could hear faint whispers carried on the wind. Sleep was impossible, and I spent the rest of the night in a state of heightened alertness, every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs setting my nerves on edge. As dawn broke, I returned to the cabin, determined to uncover its secrets. I examined the photographs more closely, and a sickening realization began to dawn on me. The people in the pictures, they were victims. I found old newspaper clippings tucked away in a drawer, detailing a series of disappearances in the area dating back over 50 years. The article spoke of a suspected serial killer who was never caught, and the cabin seemed to be his lair. The air grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over me. I felt a presence, as if the cabin itself was watching me, waiting for me to leave. I knew I had to get out of there, but I also felt a responsibility to bring this dark chapter to light. As I stepped outside, the forest seemed to close in around me. The path back to my campsite felt longer and more treacherous than before. I was nearly there when I heard it. A low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush. I turned, my flashlight beam sweeping through the darkness. There, just beyond the reach of the light, stood a figure. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. The same twisted smile from the photographs was etched on its face. Panic surged through me and I ran. Branches whipped at my face, and my heart pounded in my chest. The footsteps followed, growing louder and more frantic. I could feel its breath on my neck, cold and foul. I stumbled, falling to the ground, and the figure loomed over me, its eyes glowing with malevolent intent. In a desperate bid for survival, I scrambled to my feet and sprinted towards the safety of my truck. I could hear the figure's raspy breathing right behind me, its presence an oppressive force that threatened to drag me down. I reached my truck, flung the door open, and jumped inside, slamming the door shut just as the figure's hand reached for me. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. As I drove away, the forest seemed to close in behind me, swallowing the cabin and its dark history once more. I reported my findings to the authorities, and an investigation was launched. The cabin was thoroughly searched, and the photographs and newspaper clippings were collected as evidence. The case of the missing people was reopened, but no definitive answers were found. The identity of the killer, or the entity that haunted the cabin, remained a mystery. I never returned to that part of the forest. The experience left me with a deep sense of unease, a constant reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. I retired a few years later, but the memories of that night still haunt me. I often wonder if the cabin still stands, hidden away in the depths of the forest, waiting for its next unsuspecting victim. The forest, once my sanctuary, had become a place of fear and uncertainty. The shadows that I had once found comforting now seemed to hide unspeakable horrors. The cabin and its dark history were a chilling reminder that even in the most familiar places, the unknown can still reach out and touch you, leaving a lasting mark on your soul. I was thrilled when I got the job as a forest ranger. It was my dream job since childhood, inspired by endless summers spent camping with my family and learning about nature from my father. Now at 25, I was finally a ranger. My name is Rosie Parker, and I had just finished my training and was about to embark on my first solo patrol in the vast, dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. My mentor, Ranger Harris, had been in the service for over 3 decades. He was gruff but kind, and he had a way of making you feel like you were part of something much larger than yourself. On my last day of training, he handed me the keys to the ranger station and patted me on the shoulder. Just remember, Rosie, the forest is a living entity. It has its own rhythm and secrets. Respect it, and it'll respect you, he said, his eyes twinkling with a mix of wisdom and something else. Something I couldn't quite place at the time. I nodded eagerly, ready to take on the world, or at least my small corner of it. My first solo patrol was to cover the North Loop, a less traveled part of the forest known for its dense foliage and old-growth trees. It was a place that few ventured into, and that was part of its allure. Little did I know that my excitement would soon turn into a creeping dread that would haunt me for years to come. The sun was beginning to set as I locked up the ranger station and headed out. The forest during the day was a symphony of life. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, the distant sound of a stream. But as night began to fall, the atmosphere changed. The vibrant greens and browns of the forest floor turned into a murky, indistinguishable mass, and the towering trees became looming silhouettes against the darkening sky. I had been out at night before during training, but this was different. There was a certain weight to the air, a stillness that seemed unnatural. The only light came from my flashlight and the occasional sliver of moonlight that managed to pierce through the thick canopy above. Every step I took seemed to echo in the silence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trail was narrow and winding, with roots and rocks jutting out at odd angles, waiting to trip up the unwary. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing in from all sides. I tried to keep my focus on the path ahead, but my mind kept wandering, imagining shapes in the shadows and eyes peering out from the darkness. It started with the sounds. At first they were subtle, a rustling in the bushes, the snap of a twig. I told myself it was just the normal sounds of the forest at night. Animals were moving about, going about their nocturnal routines. But as the night wore on, the noises became more distinct, more deliberate. Footsteps, slow and heavy, seemed to follow me at a distance, always just out of sight. I stopped several times, shining my flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing there, just the still, oppressive darkness. My heartbeat quickened, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew something was off. As I continued my patrol, shadows seemed to move at the edge of my vision. I would catch a glimpse of something, a figure, maybe, darting behind a tree, only to find nothing when I turned to look. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, more insistent. It was as if the forest itself was alive, aware of my presence and intent on driving me out. By midnight I was on edge. Every sound, every shadow seemed like a threat. I knew I had to investigate, if only to put my mind at ease. I decided to leave the trail and head towards the area where the noises seemed to be coming from. It was a risky move, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that needed to be found. I moved cautiously, my flashlight sweeping back and forth as I navigated through the dense underbrush. The forest floor was uneven, and I had to watch my step to avoid tripping over roots and rocks. The sounds grew louder as I approached, more distinct. I could hear whispering, soft and unintelligible, like voices carried on the wind. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed forward, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, and my hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I was close, too close to turn back now. I stepped into a small clearing, and my flashlight illuminated a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with pale skin and hollow eyes. He wore old, tattered clothing, and his hair was matted and unkempt. He stared at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "Who are you?" I managed to stammer, my voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me. I took a step forward, and he took a step back, retreating into the shadows. I followed, driven by a mix of curiosity and fear. As I got closer, I noticed something strange about the way he moved. It was as if he was gliding, his feet barely touching the ground. "Wait," I called out, but he vanished into the darkness. I shone my flashlight around, trying to catch a glimpse of him, but he was gone. I felt a surge of panic and turned to head back to the trail, but the forest seemed different now, twisted and unfamiliar. I stumbled through the underbrush, disoriented and frightened. The whispers were all around me, growing louder and more insistent. I could hear footsteps, heavy and deliberate, following me through the darkness. I broke into a run, my flashlight bobbing wildly as I tried to find my way back. Suddenly I tripped and fell, landing hard on the forest floor. My flashlight slipped from my grasp and rolled away, its beam flickering and dying. I lay there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps grew closer, and I could feel a presence looming over me. I looked up, and there he was, the man from the clearing. He stood over me, his eyes glowing with a strange, otherworldly light. He reached out a hand, and I felt a cold, clammy grip on my arm. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My vision blurred, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. When I came to, it was morning. The sun was shining, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects. I was lying on the trail, my flashlight beside me. I sat up, my head spinning, and looked around. There was no sign of the man, no sign of the strange occurrences from the night before. I made my way back to the ranger station, my mind reeling. I reported the incident to Ranger Harris, but he just nodded knowingly. "The forest has its secrets, Rosie," he said. "Sometimes it's best to let them be." I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered something beyond my understanding, something that defied logic and reason. The experience left me with a deep sense of unease, a constant reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown. I continued my work as a ranger, but I was never the same. The forest, once a place of solace and tranquility, had become a place of mystery and danger. I found myself avoiding the North Loop, unwilling to venture into that dark, twisted part of the woods. The memories of that night haunted me, a constant reminder of the things that lurk in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. I often wondered about the man I had seen, the strange, ghostly figure that had led me into the darkness. Was he a lost soul, trapped in the forest for eternity? Or was he something else, something more sinister? The questions remained unanswered, a dark, nagging presence in the back of my mind. I had encountered the unknown, and it had left its mark on me, a mark that would never fade. The forest, with all its beauty and wonder, had shown me its darker side, a side that few ever see and even fewer understand. As the years passed, I came to accept the experience as a part of my life, a chapter in the story of my time as a ranger. It was a reminder of the fragile line between the known and the unknown, a line that I had crossed, if only for a moment. And in that moment, I had glimpsed the true nature of the forest, a place of secrets and shadows, where the past and present collide in a dance of light and darkness. I had always been drawn to the solitude of the forest. The vast, uncharted wilderness had a way of making the worries of the modern world feel small and insignificant. As a forest ranger stationed in a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains, I was often the only human presence for miles. The isolation was both a comfort and a responsibility, as it was my job to ensure the safety and preservation of this pristine environment. The ranger station where I lived and worked was a modest wooden cabin, nestled in a dense grove of ancient pine trees. It was equipped with all the necessities: radio communication, a small kitchen, and a bedroom, but the real luxury was the view. From my porch, I could see rolling hills covered in dense foliage, a sea of green that stretched as far as the eye could see. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves the distant call of a hawk, and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. My name is Jack Thompson, and I've been a forest ranger for nearly a decade. I took pride in my work, patrolling the trails, monitoring wildlife, and ensuring that visitors respected the natural beauty of the area. My days were filled with routine tasks, checking trail markers, clearing fallen branches, and occasionally assisting hikers or campers. The solitude was invigorating, and I relished the peace and quiet. Every morning I would start my day with a cup of coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the sky with hues of orange and pink. Then I would gear up and head out on my patrol, armed with a radio, a first aid kit, and a map of the area. The trails were well worn but could be treacherous for those unfamiliar with the terrain. My job was to ensure that everyone who ventured into the forest returned safely. It was late September when the call came in. A hiker, a young woman named Sarah, had been reported missing. She had set out on a solo hike 3 days earlier and was supposed to return the previous evening. When she didn't show up, her family grew worried and contacted the authorities. The task of finding her fell to me, as I was the closest ranger to her last known location. I immediately felt a knot of worry in my stomach. The forest could be unforgiving, especially for those who weren't prepared for its challenges. I grabbed my gear and set out, following the trail that Sarah had planned to take. The path wound through dense underbrush, over rocky outcrops and past towering pines that seemed to reach for the sky. I moved quickly, hoping to find some sign of her, a footprint, a piece of clothing, anything that might lead me to her. As the hours passed, my anxiety grew. The forest was eerily silent, the usual sounds of wildlife replaced by an oppressive stillness. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I called out her name repeatedly, my voice echoing off the trees, but there was no response. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor, and I knew I had to make camp for the night. I pitched my tent near a small clearing and settled in, the sense of unease growing with each passing minute. The next morning I resumed my search with renewed determination. I followed the trail deeper into the forest, my eyes scanning the ground for any sign of Sarah. After several hours, I came across a small, overgrown path that veered off the main trail. It was barely visible, hidden by years of neglect and encroaching vegetation. Something about it felt off, as if it hadn't been touched by human presence in a long time. Despite the nagging feeling of unease, I decided to follow the path. It led me to a small, secluded clearing, where I found the remnants of an old campsite. The fire pit was cold, and the tent was in tatters, as if it had been abandoned years ago. But what really caught my attention was the journal lying on the ground, half buried under fallen leaves. I picked it up and carefully opened it, the pages yellowed and brittle with age. The entries were dated from nearly a decade ago and detailed the experiences of a hiker named David Reynolds. He wrote about his love for the forest, the beauty of the untouched wilderness, and his desire to escape the chaos of city life. But as I read further, the tone of the journal changed. David began to describe strange occurrences, unexplained noises at night, shadows moving just beyond the edge of his campfire, and the feeling of being watched. His final entry was a hastily scrawled message: "It's out there. I can feel it. Watching. Waiting. I don't think I'll make it out." A chill ran down my spine as I closed the journal. The forest suddenly felt darker, more menacing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, just as David had described. I continued my search, my senses on high alert. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, reaching out like grasping hands. As I pressed on, I came across more unsettling signs. broken branches, deep gouges in the tree trunks, and strange symbols carved into the bark. It was as if someone or something had marked the territory, warning intruders to stay away. The further I went, the more the sense of dread grew. I knew I was getting closer to whatever had caused Sarah's disappearance, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to find her, no matter the cost. The trail led me to a dark, narrow ravine, its walls covered in thick moss and tangled roots. As I descended, the temperature dropped, and a dense fog began to roll in, obscuring my vision. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and I had to fight the urge to turn back. But I pressed on, driven by a sense of duty and a desperate hope that I might still find Sarah alive. At the bottom of the ravine, I found a small cave entrance, barely visible through the thick undergrowth. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached, the darkness within seeming to pulse with a life of its own. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The cave was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and rot. The walls were covered in strange, twisted carvings, and the floor was littered with bones, animal and human alike. I felt a surge of panic, but I forced myself to remain calm. I had to find Sarah. Deeper into the cave, I found her. She was lying on the ground, unconscious but alive. Her clothes were torn, and she was covered in scratches and bruises. I knelt beside her, checking for signs of life, and was relieved to find a weak pulse. But before I could celebrate, I heard it, a low, guttural growl that echoed through the cave. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam falling on the source of the sound. It was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. Tall and emaciated, with pale, leathery skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were dark pits, and its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth. It moved with a predatory grace, its movements slow and deliberate. Fear paralyzed me for a moment, but I knew I had to act. I grabbed Sarah and hoisted her over my shoulder, turning to run. The creature let out a bone-chilling howl and lunged after us, its claws scraping against the cave walls. I sprinted through the darkness, my heart pounding in my ears. The creature was fast, too fast. It was gaining on us, and I knew we wouldn't make it out of the cave in time. I spotted a narrow crevice in the cave wall and ducked inside, pulling Sarah with me. The creature screeched in frustration, its claws swiping at the entrance but unable to reach us. I held my breath, praying it would give up and leave. Hours passed before I dared to move. The creature had eventually retreated, but I could still hear its distant growls echoing through the cave. I knew we had to get out of there, but the way back was treacherous, and Sarah was barely conscious. I carried her as best I could, navigating the dark, winding passages until we finally emerged into the light of day. We made it back to the ranger station, where I radioed for help. Sarah was taken to the hospital, and I filed my report detailing everything I had seen, but as the days turned into weeks, the questions remained unanswered. What was that creature? How long had it been lurking in the forest, preying on unsuspecting hikers? And most importantly, would it strike again? The forest, once a place of solace and tranquility, had become a place of fear and uncertainty. I continued my work as a ranger, but the memories of that night haunted me, a constant reminder of the darkness that lay just beyond the edge of the known world. The forest had its secrets, and some of them were better left undiscovered. I often thought about David Reynolds, the hiker who had written the journal. He had encountered the same creature, and it had cost him his life. I was lucky to have survived, but the experience had changed me. I was more cautious, more aware of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. The forest was a living entity, and it had its own rhythm and secrets. Respect it, and it will respect you. Ignore its warnings, and you may never return. The legend of the creature spread, and fewer hikers ventured into the North Loop. The forest reclaimed its solitude, the trail growing over with vegetation. But I knew it was still out there, watching, waiting. And every time I patrolled the forest, I felt its presence, a constant reminder of the fragile line between the known and the unknown. The forest had its secrets, and I was one of the few who had glimpsed the darkness that lay within. Whispering Pines National Park was a sprawling wilderness nestled in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. The park was renowned for its dense forests, rugged trails, and breathtaking vistas. It was a haven for nature enthusiasts, hikers and campers who sought solace in its serene beauty. The park's name came from the whispering sounds the wind made as it threaded its way through the tall pines, a sound that could be both soothing and eerie, depending on the listener's perspective. The park was massive, stretching over hundreds of miles with areas that were rarely visited by humans. Some parts of Whispering Pines were so remote that even the most seasoned rangers had never set foot there. This isolation lent an air of mystery to the park, with countless legends and stories about unexplained phenomena and strange occurrences passed down through generations of park visitors and staff. My name is Linda, and I've been a park ranger at Whispering Pines for nearly 5 years. I took the job right out of college, drawn to the allure of working in the great outdoors and protecting the natural beauty I had always loved. Growing up, my family spent summers camping and hiking, instilling in me a deep appreciation for nature and a desire to preserve it. I started my career at the park with enthusiasm and a sense of adventure. The work was challenging but rewarding. I patrolled the trails, educated visitors about safety and conservation, and occasionally rescued hikers who had underestimated the difficulty of the terrain. The park became my second home, a place where I felt a deep sense of belonging and purpose. But as much as I loved Whispering Pines, I couldn't ignore the fact that it had a darker side. Over the years, I heard countless stories from fellow rangers and visitors about strange occurrences in the park. Unexplained noises, sightings of shadowy figures, and even reports of people disappearing without a trace. At first, I dismissed these stories as mere folklore, tales spun to add an element of danger to the wilderness experience. But as time went on, I began to see and hear things that made me question my skepticism. The first strange occurrence I experienced happened during my second year at Whispering Pines. I was on a routine patrol, hiking a remote trail that wound through one of the park's densest forests. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I was about 5 miles from the nearest campsite when I heard it, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from all around me. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard. It wasn't an animal cry, and it certainly wasn't human. It was a chilling, otherworldly noise that sent shivers down my spine. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining to pinpoint the source of the sound, but it seemed to echo from every direction. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the wailing stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. When I returned to the ranger station that evening, I mentioned the incident to my colleagues. To my surprise, they weren't shocked or dismissive. Instead, they shared their own experiences. Justin, a veteran ranger who had been at the park for over a decade, told me about a time he had found a circle of perfectly arranged stones in a clearing, with no signs of human activity nearby. Laura, another ranger, spoke of seeing fleeting shadows flitting between the trees at dusk, even when she was sure she was alone. These stories were unsettling, but what disturbed me the most were the reports of disappearances. Over the years, several hikers and campers had vanished without a trace in Whispering Pines. Some were found days or weeks later, disoriented and with no memory of what had happened. Others were never seen again. The park's remote areas and challenging terrain made search and rescue operations difficult, but the sheer number of cases was alarming. One late autumn evening, I was assigned to patrol a particularly remote section of the park known as Black Hollow. Black Hollow was notorious among the rangers for its dense foliage and rugged terrain. It was an area that few visitors ventured into, and even fewer returned from with a desire to revisit. The trail was narrow and overgrown, with gnarled roots and thorny bushes making progress slow and treacherous. As I made my way deeper into Black Hollow, the trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out most of the fading sunlight. The forest floor was carpeted with a thick layer of leaves, muffling my footsteps and adding to the sense of isolation. I checked my map and realized I was about 3 miles from the nearest trailhead when I heard it. A faint rustling sound, followed by the snapping of twigs. I stopped and scanned the area, but I saw nothing unusual. I called out, thinking it might be a hiker in need of assistance, but there was no response. I waited a few moments, then continued on my patrol, my senses on high alert. The rustling sound came again, closer this time, followed by a low, throaty growl that sent a jolt of fear through me. I turned around, my hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight on my belt. I shone the beam into the underbrush, but all I saw were shadows. The growling stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I knew I had to keep moving, but every step felt like a struggle against the growing sense of dread that gripped me. As I neared a small clearing, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the clearing was a large, ancient oak tree, its twisted branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. At the base of the tree, arranged in a crude circle, were dozens of small, weathered dolls. They were old and tattered, their button eyes staring blankly into the void. Some were missing limbs, and others had their faces crudely stitched with red thread. I approached the circle cautiously, my flashlight beam flickering as if the batteries were dying. The air grew colder, and a sense of malevolence seemed to emanate from the circle of dolls. I felt a strong urge to leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and picked up one of the dolls, turning it over in my hands. It was covered in dirt and mold, and as I examined it, I noticed something even more disturbing: a small, faded name tag sewn into the fabric. The name was Josie. A chill ran down my spine. Josie was the name of one of the hikers who had disappeared in Whispering Pines 3 years earlier. I quickly checked the other dolls and found more name tags, each one corresponding to a missing person reported in the park over the past decade. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Who had placed these dolls here and why? Suddenly, the growling sound returned, louder and more menacing than before. I dropped the doll and stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows around the clearing seemed to move, coalescing into a dark, amorphous shape that slithered toward me. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering wildly, and then I heard a voice, soft and whispery, like the wind through the pines. It said, "Leave now, or you'll join them." Panic surged through me, and I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush in a blind frenzy. The growling grew fainter, but I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, my lungs burning and my legs trembling. I radioed the ranger station and reported what I had found, my voice shaking with fear. Justin and Laura met me at the trailhead, their faces grim as I recounted my experience. The discovery of the dolls and the ominous warning voice only added to the sense of unease that had been growing in Whispering Pines. Justin and Laura were just as disturbed as I was, and we decided to keep the incident quiet, fearing that it would only cause panic among visitors and make our jobs even more difficult. However, we couldn't ignore the fact that something sinister was happening in the park, something that was connected to the disappearances. Over the next few weeks, we intensified our patrols, focusing on the remote areas of the park where the disappearances had occurred. We found more unsettling signs. Strange symbols carved into tree trunks, piles of stones arranged in unnatural patterns, and even more of those eerie dolls. Each discovery added to the growing sense of dread, but none of them provided any concrete answers. The disappearances continued, despite our efforts. Hikers and campers who ventured into the park would sometimes vanish without a trace, leaving behind only their abandoned gear and a lingering sense of fear. The media picked up on the story, dubbing Whispering Pines the Vanishing Woods and speculating about what might be causing the disappearances. Some theories pointed to natural dangers, wild animals, treacherous terrain, or sudden weather changes. Others hinted at something more supernatural, a malevolent spirit, a cursed land, or a hidden cult. The park authorities were under immense pressure to solve the mystery and ensure the safety of visitors. They brought in additional rangers and search and rescue teams, but despite their best efforts, the disappearances continued. The sense of paranoia among the rangers grew, and we began to question everything we saw and heard in the forest. One night I was on patrol with Justin and Laura, searching an area near Black Hollow that had recently become a hotspot for strange activity. It was a moonless night, and the darkness seemed to swallow our flashlight beams. The forest was eerily silent, the usual sounds of nocturnal animals conspicuously absent. We moved cautiously, our senses on high alert, knowing that something was out there, watching us. We reached a small clearing and stopped to take a break. As we rested, Justin pointed out something unusual. A faint, flickering light in the distance, barely visible through the trees. We decided to investigate, moving quietly and carefully toward the light. As we got closer, we realized it was coming from an old, dilapidated cabin, half hidden by overgrown vegetation. The cabin looked abandoned, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss. The windows were broken, and the door hung ajar, creaking slightly in the breeze. The flickering light came from inside, casting eerie shadows on the walls. We exchanged nervous glances, then stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The interior of the cabin was just as decayed as the outside. The floorboards creaked under our weight, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and rot. In the center of the room, we found the source of the light. A small makeshift altar, adorned with candles, bones, and more of those unsettling dolls. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn in what looked like dried blood. As we examined the altar, a sense of dread settled over us. It was clear that this was no ordinary cabin. Someone had been using it for dark, ritualistic purposes. We were about to leave when we heard a noise. A soft, shuffling sound coming from the back of the cabin. We turned our flashlights toward the source and saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was an old man, his face haggard and his eyes worthless. He was dressed in ripped clothes and his skin was pale and sickly. He looked at us with a mixture of fear and curiosity, as if he hadn't seen another human in years. Justin stepped forward and asked him who he was and what he was doing in the cabin. The old man didn't respond at first, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Then he spoke, his voice a hoarse whisper. He told us that he was the last surviving member of a cult that had once worshipped a dark entity in the forest. The cult had been responsible for the disappearances, using the hikers and campers as sacrifices to appease the entity and gain its favor. The man explained that the entity was a malevolent spirit that had been bound to the forest for centuries. It fed on the fear and suffering of its victims, and the cult had believed that by offering sacrifices they could control its power. But the cult had been wiped out years ago, leaving the entity unchecked and hungry for more victims. We listened in stunned silence as the man recounted the history of the cult and the dark deeds they had committed. He warned us that the entity was still out there, watching us, and that it would not stop until it had claimed more lives. He urged us to leave the forest and never return. We left the cabin in a state of shock, our minds reeling from the old man's revelations. We reported everything to the park authorities, who launched a full-scale investigation into the cult and the entity. They brought in experts in paranormal phenomena, hoping to find a way to dispel the spirit and put an end to the disappearances. But despite their efforts, the entity remained elusive. The disappearances continued, and the sense of fear and unease in the park grew. Whispering Pines became a place of mystery and dread, its once serene beauty overshadowed by the darkness that lurked within. For me, the experience left a lasting mark. I continued to work as a ranger, but the forest no longer felt like a place of refuge. Every time I patrolled the trails, the whispers of the pines took on a more sinister tone, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. The park authorities eventually closed off the most remote areas of Whispering Pines, hoping to contain the entity and prevent further disappearances. But the legend of the vanishing woods persisted, and the park became a place of cautionary tales and whispered warnings. I still patrol the trails, doing my best to protect the visitors and preserve the natural beauty of the park. But I know that some mysteries are beyond our understanding and some evils cannot be easily vanquished.